Welcome to Season 3, Episode 18 of Angela Watson's Truth for Teachers. I'm your host, Angela Watson, and I'm here to speak life, encouragement, and truth into the minds and hearts of educators and get you energized for the week ahead. Today, I'm going to share my story on how I transitioned from being a classroom teacher to working as an instructional coach, curriculum designer, and educational consultant. Visit truthforteachers.com to get the transcript, links to recommended resources, and to share your thoughts on the show. I have been meaning to do an episode on this forever because I get asked a lot about my journey and how long it took me to get to where I'm at right now. I also usually get at least one interview request every week, and that puts me in the unfortunate position of either telling people no or spending a lot of time repeating basically the same thing over and over. So I thought this episode would really speak to that and really help out a lot of people who want to hear more about where I'm at. Now, the short version of this, if I had to wrap up my whole story in just a few sentences, is that I'm a national board certified teacher with 11 years of classroom experience. In 2009, I turned my passion for helping other teachers into a career as an educational consultant based in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and Brooklyn, New York. I founded my own publishing company and professional development organization called Due Season Press and Educational Services. Since then, I've authored and published 4 books, created online courses for teachers and teacherpreneurs, conducted instructional coaching all over the 5 boroughs of New York City, and presented at conferences in schools around the country and even a few internationally. Last year, I started the 40-Hour Teacher Workweek Club, in which nearly 4,000 educators have come together to learn productivity strategies and get support in working smarter, not harder. The rest of my work supporting teachers is online through my blog, which is the cornerstone for teachers, the curriculum resources that I sell on Teachers Pay Teachers, and of course, through this podcast. So, that's a lot. But I'm going to go into more detail because I figure the people who care really care and they want to know the whole story. And the people who don't care really don't care and are probably just going to skip this episode anyway. So today I'm going to share with you how I got to where I'm at today. I'm going to share details that I haven't shared publicly before. In fact, I've never really told my whole story start to finish, which is why it's going to take me a little while to cover everything. I really want to take you behind the scenes in my journey. And then in next week's episode, I'm going to share with you what I'm doing now and what's next for me professionally. In both episodes, I'm going to try to offer you some practical advice and some inspiration if you are thinking about making a change in your career, or if you just want to look for ways to impact education and help kids beyond the 4 walls of your classroom. I honestly never dreamed that I would one day run my own business. It's still a little bit surreal for me. I started teaching in 1999, and I thought I would be in the classroom forever. I dreamed about being a teacher since I was 5 years old, and I couldn't imagine doing anything else. But it was actually that love of teaching that ended up launching a business which at the time didn't even exist. My first teaching job was in Prince George's County, Maryland, in a school about a mile outside of Washington, D.C. My heart has always been in urban teaching and working in high-poverty communities, so I loved being there and I loved my job. But it was far from easy, especially since I had very little support. During my first few years, I was desperate for teaching ideas and resources. And there really wasn't a lot available online, so I had to figure out most things on my own and create my teaching materials from scratch. By 2003, online forums had become a really big thing. I spent a lot of time on teachers.net and A to Z teacher stuff message boards. I noticed that teachers there were asking the same questions over and over again. And even though I'd only been in the classroom for a few years at the time, I realized that I knew the answer to a lot of their questions, especially around classroom management. I saw teachers getting burned out by the little things that frustrate you in teaching, like trying to line up a class of 30 kids to go to lunch, or dealing with students missing work. I responded to teachers with these issues on the message boards, and I got all these responses back saying, "Thank you, that really works. Why didn't I think of that?" And it was incredibly rewarding to me to help teachers in this way. So I started a Word doc with all my answers, and I copied and pasted from there whenever teachers had questions that I didn't have to type it out from scratch. And then I realized, I could figure out how to start a website. And then I could just link them to pages in the message board forums. So I could just post the link instead of having to copy and paste the whole thing. And I could share a whole lot more information than I could just in a comment on a message board forum. They even had this new thing called a digital camera. And my school had one. So I could borrow it and take pictures of my classroom, which I could then upload to my website. So I taught myself web design and HTML just through basically trial and error and a whole lot of help from Google, or actually it was Yahoo back then. And I built out my first website. My name was still Angela Powell back then, so I called it Miss Powell's Management Ideas for Teachers. That website was my focus for many years. I just enjoyed being a teacher and sharing practical classroom ideas with other teachers online. I took pictures of what I did with my students and how I organized and managed my classroom, and I wrote about it. By 2008, I'd renamed my website the Cornerstone for Teachers and had developed a pretty large following. But even though I'd been at it for 5 years, I still had no thought whatsoever to making the website into a business. In fact, the only money that I was earning was from being an Amazon affiliate. My main focus was just on becoming the best teacher I could be and experimenting with different ways to reach my students. I craved new challenges, and I moved to different grade levels and different schools a lot so that I could experience different teaching contexts. I even changed states in 2004, and I moved down to Miami Beach, where I taught in Dade County, and then I moved slightly north to Fort Lauderdale and taught in Broward County. Each time I tried something new with my class or took a workshop or read a teaching book, I wrote about it on my website so that other teachers could benefit from what I was trying out with my students. Eventually, my website got to be so huge that people told me I should write a book and put all the info together in one spot. And so I did. I took everything from the site and expanded on it and reformatted it to create a 500-page manual called The Cornerstone, Classroom Management that Makes Teaching More Effective, Efficient, and Enjoyable. I wrote the book just like I was talking to teachers that I was mentoring or collaborating with. It's full of very down-to-earth, practical advice about how to handle all those situations that no one ever said you'd face as a teacher. It was a pretty massive project that pretty much consumed my evenings and weekends during my 8th year of teaching. I look back on the Cornerstone book now, and it continues to sell very well even to this day. There's a lot of things I would definitely change. My approach to teaching has evolved a lot over the years, but I'm still so proud of that book, and I still stand by the basic approach that I'm espousing there. The Cornerstone continues to be really the only book of its kind where a single classroom teacher is just basically pouring her heart out and sharing everything she does, along with classroom photos. So everything from organizing papers to managing back to school night to dealing with kids who throw desks at her. That book has stood in the place of a real-life mentor for more teachers than I can even count. And considering that I never had a mentor myself as a teacher, it really is an honor to think that other educators are using my advice to help them figure out all the practical aspects of running a classroom. So when I first published The Cornerstone, I went with a self-publishing company. Remember, this was 2008, and it was still kind of the thing to do because you couldn't yet upload a manuscript to Amazon and have a printed book immediately afterwards. And I had no desire to go to a traditional publisher who would try to rework my book and turn it into something else and also take a huge portion of the profits. Unfortunately, the self-publishing company that I used just turned out to be a disaster. And in preparation for my small claims case against them, I had to do a tremendous amount of research into how royalties were supposed to work and how authors should be paid and what printing costs actually were. But here's the beauty that came from those ashes. By the time I had won my settlement, I knew everything there was to know about running a publishing company. So I didn't need that company or anyone else's. That year, I founded my own publishing company, and I republished The Cornerstone myself under Due Season Press and Educational Services. That gave me total control over everything, the pricing, the cover, the content, everything. Once I'd republished the book, a few teachers and some principals started contacting me through my website to ask me to do workshops in their schools. The very first one was a small charter school with about 8 teachers locally in Fort Lauderdale. They hired me for the whole day, and they let me choose how to structure my time. So I decided to do a school-wide PD in the morning and then individual coaching with the teachers in the afternoon. That afternoon was life-changing for me. I got to go into teachers' classrooms and answer their specific questions related to their unique teaching contexts. We rearranged furniture to make the rooms more conducive to the routines and procedures that I'd share that morning. We tweaked behavior plans. We did whatever the teachers needed. And they treated me like gold because no one ever walks into a teacher's classroom and says, "I'm here to help you in any way you want me to." So you're not trying to figure everything out alone and try to implement it by yourself. What can I do to support you and to make your job easier? 2 of the 8 teachers actually cried when I said that. They were so overwhelmed and so exhausted and just feeling like all anyone ever cared about was what they were doing to support the students. No one ever stopped to ask, "Hey, teacher, how can I support you? What do you need?" And it was an experience I will never forget. It was a really pivotal moment in my career to get to work with teachers in that capacity. I will never forget the desperation in their eyes and the gratitude they felt when they realized I was there to listen to them and support them. That day, the desire to work with teachers on a larger scale beyond just my website and book, that desire was planted deeply in my heart that day. I wanted to offer other teachers the support that I had so desperately craved and never received myself when I was new. Now, I didn't become an overnight sensation by any means, and it took quite a while for the Cornerstone book and my presentations and workshops to gain any traction at all. This was still before social media and blogs were much of a thing, and it was really hard to get ideas to spread online. I started my blog that year, but I didn't get on Facebook professionally until 2012. I've generally been a late adapter for social media. I mostly just kept doing what I love to do, teaching and sharing ideas and resources about teaching. I also kept listening to teachers online about what they needed. And by now, I was hearing things like, "I would love to have you speak. You should come to Australia. You should come to Idaho." And all these requests from teachers who were wanting me to present in these random places that were going to be pretty difficult and pretty expensive to get to. I did a little bit of traveling, but honestly, I find that pretty draining. So I tried to do online webinars. My first one, believe it or not, was with a school in India, where I had to present late at night, my time, in order to be live during their morning staff meeting. It was really cool, but again, it was a big demand on my time, especially since I was still in the classroom full-time at that point. So I began to explore possibilities for creating on-demand webinars that I could record in advance, and teachers or schools could purchase and then watch whenever they wanted. I turned my main workshop into what's now available as the Cornerstone Proactive Behavior Management course. It's a self-paced online course that helps teachers who read my book, The Cornerstone, figure out where to start in terms of setting up classroom expectations, deciding on procedures and routines, and just generally creating a self-running classroom that frees them to teach, which is really the core idea of the book. So the next year, in 2009, I got married. And that's when everything changed in a really big way, both professionally and personally. My husband was living in New York, and I was still living down in Florida in my 11th year of teaching. We had dated long distance for about 3 years before getting married, and we just took turns flying back and forth. My intention was to get married and then relocate and find a teaching job in New York. However, that was the year the recession hit. And New York, which had always had a very competitive job market for teachers, was actually laying teachers off by the thousands. So I had a choice. I could stay in my comfort zone and keep teaching down in Florida and live apart from my new husband, or I could start thinking outside the box about what I could do with my desire to work with teachers and make an impact in education beyond just my classroom. As much as I was excited about more change, I was also terrified. But my husband encouraged me to take that leap of faith and try to get work as an instructional coach or educational consultant in the New York City area. Now, this is always the point where people want to know, how did you do it? How did you find this kind of work? How did you get someone to hire you? But remember, at this point, I'd been teaching for 11 years. I'd done my national board certification, and I had an outstanding resume and references. I had a very popular website that I had been working on for 6 years. I'd been documenting all the stuff that was going on with my students in my classroom. My website was basically a portfolio of everything I did as a teacher. I'd published a book for teachers, and I'd started doing a bit of coaching and consulting based on the book. So I had been working up to this transition without even realizing it for many years through doing exceptional work in the classroom and establishing my credibility by sharing what I was doing online. It really wasn't anything more complex than that. I did the work, and then I shared it. There was no shortcut. There was no big break. I just poured through the job listings online and applied for stuff that sounded good. The first educational consulting work that I got was through Brainpop, which is a Manhattan-based company that makes animated educational movies for kids. I had used Brainpop as a classroom teacher, and I loved how it helped my students. So this was a really exciting move for me. My job was to be the Brainpop Junior educational editor, meaning I outlined the scripts, I edited them, and I checked all the features to make sure that they were developmentally appropriate and aligned with standards. There were hundreds of applicants for this position, and I almost didn't get it. But Brainpop took a chance on hiring me while I was still teaching full-time in Florida, and they let me work remotely until my husband and I worked out our living situation in New York. I just fell in love with the company, and I stayed there actually for 6 years. I was working 1 to 2 days per week as the educational content creator until actually just this past December. But let me not get too far ahead of myself. At this point in 2009, I had some part-time income in New York working for Brainpop, and I was applying to all the job openings I saw for instructional coaching work. That seems to be a little easier to find in the NYC area because many of the schools here use outside consulting companies instead of hiring full-time employees as coaches. There's a handful of companies that partner with the DOE, and if you get hired by them, you can basically work as a freelancer. So you take on the schools and jobs you want, and you choose your own days and hours. I got hired by a company that was contracted with the Catholic Archdiocese for the city, and I did part-time literacy and math coaching in Catholic schools, mostly in the Bronx and Staten Island. Then I switched to another company that was contracted with many of the Jewish yeshivas and public schools, and I started doing instructional technology coaching in the Bronx, Manhattan, and Brooklyn. I also continued working part-time for Brainpop and maintaining my website and blog. So through all these experiences, I gained a lot of insight as to the issues that teachers were facing. And I knew one thing that teachers desperately needed help with was stress management. I watched many teachers create additional stress for themselves simply through the way they chose to perceive their jobs. I recognized many of their harmful thought patterns as traps that I myself had fallen into. I saw how they deliver a dynamic lesson that successfully engaged 32 kids and then beat themselves up over the 2 kids who refused to work. I listened as they told me how they lost sleep over criticism from parents and let the lack of supplies and resources stifle their creativity. These were all issues I dealt with myself, and I had making major strides in overcoming them by practicing the development of a different mindset. I wanted to write down exactly what I had done to make teaching feel less stressful to me personally. So in 2011, I published my second book. It was called Awakened: Change Your Mindset to Transform Your Teaching. The book helps teachers change the way they think about their roles as teachers, and that can change everything else. Because so much of my mindset is influenced by scripture and biblical traditions, I also wanted to publish a book just for Christian teachers on this topic. Awakened is the book for all teachers, regardless of whether they have a faith tradition or what that faith tradition might be. But the next year, in 2012, I wrote the Awakened Devotional Study Guide for Christian teachers. And that's a workbook to help Christian teachers apply the concepts from Awakened through a biblical perspective. To be honest, neither one of these books really made a huge impact on the education world right away. I never expected the devotional to. That really was just a labor of love. I'd actually been writing devotions for Christian teachers on a separate blog since 2005, and that was just more of a ministry to me. But Awakened was different. I felt like it had the potential to become really big, but for some reason it just hadn't really taken off. Next week, I'm going to share what happened that year in 2012 when I hit a breaking point. I'd published 3 books at that point, 2 of which were written back-to-back in the previous 2 years. The book writing process had completely drained me, and honestly, it even put a little bit of a strain on my marriage, as anyone who has ever attempted writing a book can definitely testify. And yet, it wasn't particularly profitable. Many people don't realize that authors only make a few dollars off of each book sale. I was also pouring my heart and soul into a website that wasn't yet making me any income, despite the fact that the whole e-commerce space had changed dramatically, and there were tons of regular people, including teachers, who were making good money online. But most frustrating of all, I was sharing ideas that I knew should be having a much bigger reach and impact than they were. I knew I could be helping more teachers, but I didn't know the first thing about marketing, and I still didn't think of myself as a business owner. I needed to go in a different direction, and I did. I was about to take some big leaps out of my comfort zone, and things were about to change for me in a major way that I could never have predicted. I'll share the conclusion of the story in next week's episode. Until then, I want to leave you with a takeaway truth to remember for the week ahead. This week's takeaway truth is this: great leaders don't set out to be great. They set out to make a difference. And I'd say that same quote holds true in our field. Great teachers don't set out to be great. They set out to make a difference. If you're listening to this and you're wondering what's next in your career, I encourage you to keep that quote in the forefront of your mind. As long as you are focused on making a difference, of identifying problems in education and offering solutions, either in the classroom or outside of it, you are destined for greatness. You can make an impact in your small corner of the world or beyond. In fact, you already are. Have a great week. You can do this. And remember, it's not going to be easy. It's going to be worth it. Truth for Teachers is a proud member of the Education Podcast Network. Podcasts for educators, podcasts by educators. For more great podcast recommendations, go to edupodcastnetwork.com. That's edupodcastnetwork.com.